All right. So if you're like, man, Kevin's all over the place, it's because he's getting married next week. So he is a little bit distracted on that front, and so that's exciting. But it's so good to be with all of you. As I said earlier, my name is Robert, and so I'm just so grateful that we get to go on this journey in the land between with one another. If you've been here a while, back in 2016, the first sermon series I ever gave was called what? The land between. That was the one I gave before we talked about the election and how to vote in that one. Some of you have either forgotten one or forgotten the other or forgotten both. But this has nothing to do with that sermon series because that was a snippet in the journey of Moses, and we're going to take actually a bigger look. So what I love about the Bible is that you can dig in and you can actually look at a sentence in the Bible. And I could probably preach about a sentence for a good 40 minutes just because there's so much in there that you can actually see with how the words and it all interacts with each other. And there's times where you're like, wow, this is mind-blowing. Then there's other times where you look at more of the narrative of the Scripture, and you're like, wow, this teaches me a lot here as well. And so what we're going to do on this journey is we're going to cover a lot of Moses' journey. So Moses was a big figure in the Bible. Last Sunday, we celebrated the resurrection of Jesus. Obviously, the biggest person, God himself, so a biggest person in the Bible that we read about, but there's also these other big people that pop up. And so Moses is one who, especially if you're Jewish, you really point to the teachings of Moses and the ways that Moses led the people called the Israelites. And before I get into all of this, this is the important thing I must note. We're going to start in the book of Exodus, but Exodus is actually a continuation of Genesis. So if you haven't even been in church before, you probably would say, yeah, Genesis is the first book of the Bible, because that's what everyone argues about, especially the first few chapters of creation. And Genesis, meaning the beginnings. Now there's this book after it called the Exodus, which is, guess what, about a exodus of these people who are slaves and then they're set free. But it's a continuation of Genesis. And so I want to encourage you to take out one of these black Bibles. You'll find them around you in the chairs. If you don't have a Bible, this is yours. Take it with you. And if you know someone who could use a Bible, give it away. But we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1, and it's going to be page 47. So before Easter, we were in the way back of the Bible, looking at a New Testament letter, 1 Timothy. And now we're going to be in the Old Testament, or some would call it the Old Covenant books, which is going to be in Exodus chapter 1. Now, to kind of summarize where we're going with this, the key that I want you to think about is this story. Recently, and this is, when I say recently, it's almost like every day I could tell this same story. I'm in the kitchen trying to get something done. And my kids are playing the Nintendo Switch, which is supposed to distract them so I can get something done. And they love this Monster Jam game, and they just they drive monster trucks and crush stuff, and they think it's sweet. Anyways, all I hear while I'm trying to be productive is, Dad, Dad, Dad. And what do? I walk over there, hey, look at this cool thing, and look at that. All right, so then I go to be productive. 2 seconds later, Dad, look at this cool thing. And it's like an ongoing thing. Kids always want attention. They always want to be seen, and they always want to be heard. Except when you're trying to be seen and heard by them, then it's just not the same category. But they want you to identify them. They want you to know them. They want you to notice them. And this happens over and over and over again. As we get older, nothing changes. We always want to be seen. We always want to be heard. We always want people to know us. But what about those times in life, those journeys, when we feel lost, where our identity seems to be in crisis, where it seems like we're yelling, Dad, 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 but no one's noticing? That's what we could call a land between moment. A land between not being known, being wanting to be known, and we feel lost. Moses, who is one of the biggest figures in all of the Bible, he actually goes through tons of moments like this. And today, we're going to look at what was his identity crisis and how he didn't even recognize who he was, or he did and the people didn't, and there was some confusion. So to get to chapter 2, which is where we're going to spend most of our time, I want to give you some background information of chapter 1. And so if you've done the Bible in a year with us, you have been through this. Some of you might have tried to breeze through Exodus, and then you got to Leviticus, and you wish you didn't breeze through Exodus. But while we were there, we see a couple things happen. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, we see the fruitfulness of the Israelites. See, what happened was the Israelites, there was Abraham, and then there was Jacob. We just sang about it. And then Jacob has 12 sons. They move to what we would later call the Promised Land, and they're living in this Promised Land. And then what happens? One of the brothers sells off his younger brother Joseph as a slave. Joseph gets sent to Egypt. Joseph is then raised up in Pharaoh's house, and he actually, after a lot of things, he was in prison. There's a lot that happens to Joseph. But then Joseph eventually has power where he sees all the grain over the whole land of Egypt, and there is a famine that goes through the land. And so where God's people, the Israelites, the people of Jacob are, what happens to the land? It dries up. And who do they need to rely on for food? Joseph, the one that they had sent off as a slave. And so then the Israelites, the people come and they get this really good, fruitful land in Egypt, and they expand and they expand and they expand. And then what happens? Well, Pharaoh, the one who had known of Joseph, the one who had seen all this takes place, he no longer lives. He passes away, and a new ruler takes over. And in verses 8 to 10, what we see is this new ruler, he now fears the Israelites. See, what happens is when people of power see other people succeeding, they don't like it. This has always happened throughout history. And so then they try to take their own power to snuff out those who are being fruitful. And so what ends up happening is Pharaoh forgets about what Joseph had done. He forgets about this history, and he begins to oppress the Israelites. He has 3 plans that he carries out in this oppression. The first is found in verses 11 to 14, where he puts them into harsh labor. And here he causes them to make bricks, and he makes it really hard on them, and it's very taxing and very toiling. And basically what he's having them do is build Amazon warehouses for him. That's what he's doing. He wants these big old storage warehouses, and he's having them build the brick and make these possible. They would be their supply centers. And so the Israelites are doing it, and they're doing it, and it wasn't enough oppression for them. So what does he do? He then says, you know what? I'm going to have your midwives actually execute your firstborn sons. Isn't that kind of sad? And we're like, no way, this is horrible. This is in the Bible. Have you realized that around the world we still have birth limits in certain nations and countries? And they do the same thing. When leaders don't see things going their way, they become more and more ridiculous. And then these women, they stand up and they say, no, we're not doing that. Like, we're going to kind of spare these babies' lives. And so then he gets even harsher and he says, no, I want you to drown the kids in the Nile River. Like, this is pretty brutal. He's getting really ferocious with these kids. And an interesting note, what I find so particularly interesting, and I encourage you to read through Exodus 1, I just want to give a summary, is that you have to look and see who's named in this chapter. And what I find so interesting is Pharaoh is never named. He remains nameless. The author of Exodus never wanted him to become famous. But the midwives are named. The ones who spare these children, the one who save their lives, the ones who allow them to not be persecuted as Pharaoh wishes. And so then in chapter 2, we begin a story of this one baby. This one baby. I'm sure there were many like him. These midwives were sparing their lives, and this is one of those kind of sad parts of history that we look at, and we're like, man, this is really sad. But now this is where we begin to see some hope. And we see the birth and raising of a baby in Exodus chapter 2, and that's where we're going to pick up. It says, about this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. So this is a man and a woman from the tribe of Levi. Guess whose tribe this is, or this lineage from Jacob? The Levites, the son Levi. And the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. I just think that this is crazy to have to think about trying to keep a kid hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. This baby is born. She tries to hide the baby. She can no longer hide the baby, so what does she do? She builds a reed basket, and she covers it with tar and pitch, and she puts a baby in the basket, and she puts it in the river. I can't imagine being in her shoes at this time, but she's just taking this baby and literally trusting that the best will happen for this child at 3 months old. Now, there's a couple things here. The one thing is, I always try to look and say, okay, I hear a lot of things happening in our world, and how can we just take this and immediately apply this to our world? One thing that really struck me is if you read through Exodus 1 and then especially chapter 2, a lot of hands are involved in helping this baby to do very well and succeed. This baby is going to make it. We're going to follow the journey. But what I always really find interesting is these women, particularly these women who helped fight what was really an injustice of the time, Pharaoh doing this. No one would say that that was right, but they all operate within their given sphere that they can. So here is a mom doing what she can to take care of this baby for as long as she can, and when she no longer can, she now passes off this baby to the next person who we're going to see take care of it. I think so often in our lives, we try to go outside of our spheres of influence. But oftentimes, we should just work within the realm that God has allowed us to work. That's a side note. Sorry, I like side notes. But the boy was placed in this reed basket, and it was waterproofed with tar and pitch. There is a story in the Old Testament, in Genesis, the book before Exodus, of another ark that was built. And it was placed in a water. And it was helping to save a people who were full of unrighteousness. There's a correlation here to the Noah's ark. We can look at how that was covered with pitch and how it helped deliver the people from destruction. In the same way, God was going to use this baby to deliver the people from destruction. The second thing is the boy was placed in a reed basket. Now, as the image of our series shows, you can see a parting of the Red Sea. This is also known as the Sea of Reeds. What I find so interesting about this is that the journey of this baby begins in a basket of reeds, and the climax of the journey is going to be when the baby now becomes a man and helps people cross this sea of reeds. It's amazing how the Bible does this, how we see this journey throughout the text, and how eventually this basket would lead to even a greater crossing. And what we see when we look at that is that this baby was in the land between. In between the land of oppression and the land of freedom. Oppression from the Egyptians and freedom from them, because we know the story. The baby will grow up and will lead the people away from their slavery. We also see that this baby is in the between of the have been and the not yet. The land they once inhabited, Israel, is where Jacob had raised his family. And that is the same land that they are promised to inherit again. We see that a boy born of Israelite blood, nursed with Israelite milk, but raised in an Egyptian household, he begins to have a confused identity. If we read in verses 4 to 9, it says, "The baby's sister then stood at the distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw a basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. 'This must be one of the Hebrew children,' she said." Here is an important thing. The princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, the ruler, notices this baby, and what does she identify him as? A Hebrew. It's very important in this journey that we notice this. And he's identified as a Hebrew. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Moms, this is a pretty good deal if you think about it. She got paid to nurse her baby. Somehow, this baby is reunited with her mom, nursed by her mom, and cared for by his mom. But then what happens? Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." Who gave him his name? It was Pharaoh's daughter. Who adopted him as her child? It was Pharaoh's daughter. All of a sudden, Moses, who was raised as an Israelite in so many ways, is now an Egyptian. He was now struck between two people groups, being an Israelite from the tribe of Levi, who was the third son of Jacob. He's now named by an Egyptian. And what's so interesting is when he's named Moses, we know that in Hebrew it means to lift out, but there is something that is left out of the text. Often when you read the lineages and you read through the boring parts of the Bible, I know it's really boring, it would say something along this line of Joseph, the son of Jacob. Moses never is identified with that. It's never Moses, the son of. It's left blank. And there's something to this. He grows up physically while struggling with who he is. A major part of growing up is discovering who we are and what our purpose is. I find this from the youngest of age. Just the other day, Jacob came to the realization that he probably won't be an NFL football player. And I said to him, "Well, you can keep striving, but I'm glad you have that reality." Owen told me he wants to be a police officer. I'm sure that'll change within a year or 2 or 5. And we go through high school, and they put you on now career tracks, which then tell you what you're going to be. I'll never forget going through high school and being told I would be a coal miner. They didn't ask me my height. That was the problem. And so we thought we would know what we are when we go into college, and then the average college student switches their major 4 to 5 times. And then we go on this journey of life and our careers, and we thought we know what we are then, and guess what happens? We keep questioning who we are and what our purpose is. This is something that we all struggle with to one degree or another. We grow older, but yet we struggle with our identity. What is our purpose and who are we? Moses' identity was deeper than a career. His identity was who he was. As he grew up, Moses still identified himself as a Hebrew. And it is important for us to note this. Verse 11 shows us where this is the case. It just jumps. He just grows. So we see the story of a baby, and now we jump. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people. Who? The Hebrews. And he saw how hard they were forced to work. During the visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his who? Fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. This is wild. Moses is a murderer. And why is he killing this person? Because he's upset with how they are treating his people. He identified himself as a Hebrew. This text makes it clear that he identified this way. He saw an Egyptian beating up one of his fellow Hebrews, and so he acted on it. But do you think he was identified as a Hebrew by outsiders? He himself knew he was a Hebrew. But how did the outsiders identify him? We're going to jump a few verses to verse 19. And it says that an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, they answered. There's this story of these daughters. They go back to their dad and they talk about what happened at a well. And what do they say? And it's Moses who rescues them from these shepherds who are being cruel. And what do they identify him as? They say, it's an Egyptian who rescued us from the shepherds. And he drew water for us and watered the flocks. Moses scurries away. He rushes away from his murderous act. He runs. He goes into this land called Midian. He then, this is a few verses that you would have read, he then goes in there and he goes to this well and he kind of gets these shepherds to stop bothering these women, and they go home and they say, Dad, this guy really took care of us, but he was what? An Egyptian. So everything about his look, everything about his dress, everything about who Moses looked like, he looked like an Egyptian, yet who did he identify as? He identified as a Hebrew. He was stuck in this land between. He saw himself as this way. But the world saw him as this way. And come on, I know so many of your stories because I've gotten to share cups of coffee with you, share meals with you. And I know that in your world, this happens all the time. Maybe you did a crime or did some time for something, and the world still identifies you by that. But you know that you're a free child of God. Maybe you have a past that you can't get rid of, and it continually creeps up on you. Or maybe an event happened to you, a very traumatic event. And I know this happens to a lot of us, and we still hold on to that identity, yet we know that that's not who we are. And oftentimes, the world sees us maybe for our job or our title or our responsibility, but we know that we're something more than that. And so often we're stuck in this land between of who we see ourselves as and who the world portrays us to be. Moses looked the part of an Egyptian, but his blood and his natural background was not Egyptian. It was Hebrew. If we go back through the verses, we see there's a real tension that takes place. And it's that it's hard for Moses to fit in anywhere. We see that he grows up. He sees this issue between this Egyptian beating the Israelites. He goes and he takes the life in the name of trying to create justice. Verse 13 says, the next day when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. And why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to one who started the fight. And the man replied, who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? So here he's trying to make peace within his own people. And they're like, get away from us. You're not one of us. Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. He no longer even fits into Pharaoh's house. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. And that's where we see the story of him coming in contact with these women who identify him as an Egyptian. Moses was then accepted, but he wasn't settled. Verses 16 to 20 continue. It says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped and rescued from the girls the shepherds, and he drew water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, who we'll see has 2 names, their father, he asked, why are you back so soon today? An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, they answered. And then he drew water and watered our flocks. Then where is he, the father asked. Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us. And what happens in verse 21? Moses accepted the invitation, and he settled there with them. In time, Reuel, who we also know as Jethro, gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later, she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, what in this naming of his son? Here it is. I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. The reason he names his son what he names him is about the struggle that he is battling, that he's stuck between this land between. He feels like a foreigner in a foreign land. Here he's married, he's having a kid, starting a family, and yet he feels lost. You can see so much of what he's experienced based on how he named his child. We see the struggle that he is going through and how he identifies as a foreigner. And to some degree, we all struggle with this. Where is our place and what is our purpose? That is the 2 questions that we often will wrestle with time and time again. And there are times in our lives where things are turned completely upside down. And when things in our lives are turned upside down, what we thought was our identity tends to be turned upside down. The parent who becomes an empty nester all of a sudden. The kids are out of the house. What do we do now? For so long, we are a soccer mom or a baseball mom or a chess team mom. Whatever it is, we were this. But all of a sudden, I'm no longer that. And my kids are older and they're grown up and they're on their own. When we retire from a career, for so long I was this, and now I'm a golfer, just not on the PGA Tour. And we have these struggles that we battle with as we go through that change. A breakup, a divorce, a loss of someone close to us. I was a wife or I was a husband, and it's no longer there. And our identity is shook to the core. We apply for that job and it's not accepted. Or we get fired from that job, or we get let go from that job, and all of a sudden, everything seems to change. And it's in those moments that we ask ourselves, what is my purpose? And we can see that Moses, in this moment, is still struggling with that. And he doesn't know who he is. And yet, we're going to find out that God's going to use Moses in some incredible and mighty ways. And yet, he's just as confused as any of us have been. There's a pastor who passed away. He pastored a small church on the East Coast, but no one would realize he pastored a small church because he wrote so many books. He translated the entire Bible. It's the Message translation. His name was Eugene Peterson. And he reminds us in his book, Run with Horses, which I highly recommend reading his book if you're ever interested in. I mean, some of his thoughts are a little bit deep, but he reminds us in ways in which our modern life depersonalizes and degrades us. We become a number and not a name. We are valued for what we do and not for who we are. This struck real with me when I turned in my dad's name badge, his car keys, and his computer to the company that he had worked in for his entire life after he had passed. It was, "Thank you, your dad served us well," and that was the last I heard from him. He was an employee ID. He was a number. He was someone that was replaceable. And that so often happens in our life. Our identity is in this way. But this little excerpt is a powerful reminder that our worth and value come from being children of God. And given names are a significant part, and they shape our identity. This is what Peterson writes, and it's on the screen to follow along. "If I am frequently and authoritatively treated impersonally, I begin to think of myself the same way. I consider myself in terms of how I fit into the statistical norms. I evaluate myself in terms of my usefulness. I assess my worth in response to how much others want me or don't want me. In the process of going along with such procedures, I find myself defined by a label, squeezed into a role, functioning at the level of my Social Security number. It requires assertive, lifelong effort to keep our names in front. No one can assess my significance by looking at the work I do. No one can determine my worth by deciding the salary they will pay me. No one can know what is going on in my mind by examining my school transcripts. No one can know me by measuring me or weighing me or analyzing me. Call my name." I think of this all the time. What was your ACT score as you apply for college? What was your GPA? It wasn't what was your name. What degree do you have? What accomplishments do you have? It's not who are you. And all Peterson is saying is there's an importance to calling on a name. And who was Moses? He was the son of who? It's not named. He feels like an Egyptian, he in one way, and an Israelite in another way. Next week, we're going to go through a whole lot more of this land between. But in chapter 3, there's this powerful moment. And we'll examine it a lot more next week. But it's this burning bush moment. And in this burning bush moment, this bush is consumed is ablaze by fire, but it's not consumed by it. It's not burning. It's just, there's a fire. And there's this holy moment where Moses takes off his sandals because he's on holy ground. And this is what it says in verse 4. "When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, 'Moses, Moses.'" The holy God, the God above all gods, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, he calls on Moses by name. I want you to think about that moment for him. Why that would be a holy moment for Moses. He's felt like a foreigner. He's felt lost. And all of a sudden, the God of the universe cries out, "Moses." This is a powerful moment for him. Verse 6, he says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." What does God say? "I know you, and I see you, and you are an Israelite." And what we're going to see is God's going to say, "I am going to use you." I want to leave you with this. Whatever story you're in, whatever land between you're stuck in, God calls you by name. And there's no greater identity you can have than a child of God. I'm not just a husband or a father. I'm not just a pastor or a neighbor or a friend or a coworker or whatever label you want to stick on there. Because in a moment, any of those titles could be gone. But the one thing that is promised to me is that I am a child of God, and that can't be taken away. In John chapter 1, the New Testament gospel, it says this in verses 10 to 13. He came into the world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. If you've ever felt not recognized, Jesus wasn't recognized. He came into his own people, and even they rejected him. But to all who believed him and accepted him, he gave the right to become what? Children of God. They are reborn, not with a physical birth resulting from human passion or plan, but a birth that comes from God. If you have called on the name of Jesus, if you have said, Jesus, you are the Savior of my life, Jesus, you are the Messiah, Yeshua, the one who you say you are, and you believe it, he says, you're not just born of Bill and Beth, you're my child. You're my son. You're my chosen one. Not chosen one like Jesus, don't hear me like that. But I chose you. I adopted you. I call you by name. And so wherever you are, I want to encourage you, God is there with you because he's been there himself. If you felt rejected, he's been rejected. But don't let others define you. Let God define you. And the question is, where are you going with him? Will you pray with me?